friends, and welcome to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion podcast. The Sefer HaZohar, or Book of Illumination, is the central text of the medieval mystical traditions known as Kabbalah. It is one of the most influential and revered texts in the history of Judaism, playing a central role in the development of Jewish ideas for at least the last 500 years. Even Jews who aren't mystically inclined are often taught to respect the Zohar as a holy artifact and also as a repository of profound divine wisdom. But what exactly is the Zohar? When, how, and under what circumstances was it written? What are the major ideas of the Zohar, and how do its authors present them? With us to discuss these questions is a world-renowned expert on the Zohar, a man who spent close to 20 years producing the definitive translation of the Zohar, the monumental 12-volume Pritzker edition, published by Stanford University in 2018. This man is Dr. Daniel Matt, the famed author, speaker, and scholar across many areas of Jewish thought. His latest book is the award-winning biography titled Becoming Elijah, Prophet of Transformation, published by Yale in 2022. And he also teaches Zohar courses online. More information can be found at his website. It is a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Matt to the podcast of Jewish Ideas. Welcome, sir.
Good to be with you.
Fantastic. So let's jump into the Zohar, because there is an enormous amount to talk about. So many are familiar with the Zohar. They've seen the Zohar on their bookshelf, usually several volumes. But before we go to the work itself, how would you define the Zohar? What would you call it, and in what genre would you place it?
The Zohar is really a type of midrash. You could call it a mystical midrash on the Torah. It's certainly not systematic theology, far from systematic. It's very unsystematic. Gershom Scholem, the great founder of the scientific study, academic study of Kabbalah, calls it a kind of mystical novel. That's a little bit of hyperbole, but you do find the main hero, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and his colleagues, the Chavraya. They're wandering through the land of Israel, running into colorful characters on the road, a donkey driver, a little child who knows more than the rabbis. But the Zohar is basically a running commentary on the Zohar, interspersed with a narrative about Rabbi Shimon and his colleagues discussing Torah.
Interesting. And before we jump into anything else, there's one sort of elephant in the room that has to be addressed at the beginning, namely the authorship of the Zohar, because of course the Zohar does record the life and times and doings of the 2nd century sage Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, lived in the Roman period, and his son Rabbi Elazar, and their various colleagues and friends that are part of this mystical circle. And so therefore the accompanying tradition, at least certainly in Orthodox circles today, you'll find is that Rabbi Shimon and his circle are in fact the authors of this book. But the academic world, at least for the last couple centuries, has taken a different stance. Is this correct?
Yeah, this is fascinating. The Zohar, as you say, is attributed to Rashbi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and that's really why it became so prominent and so influential. People in the Middle Ages really believed that it did go back to the 2nd century. And as you say, many traditional Jews today still hold that belief. But it seems pretty clear that the work was really composed over 1,000 years after Rabbi Shimon in 13th century Spain. We don't know for sure who the author was, but it seems that one Kabbalist, Moshe de Leon, I like to call him Ramdal, Rabbi Moshe de Leon, it seems I'm convinced that he composed a good percentage of the work. So the question is, why didn't he come out and admit that he was the author? Most authors are proud of what they've written. They want that broadcast. But Moshe de Leon claimed that he was copying from this ancient text. So if that's true, why did he attribute it to Rashbi? You could say partly so that the book would be accepted. Moshe de Leon is really reimagining Judaism, reimagining the who God is. And for example, if he had come out and said, I have an idea, God is a woman, might not have gone over so well. But here it's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the great Tana, the great teacher of the Mishnah, who himself is talking about the romance within God, God as infinity, and Sof, the various radical ideas of Kabbalah that we'll get to. So if Moshe de Leon had come out and said, here is what I think, he would have aroused a lot of opposition. By attributing it to Rashbi, to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he really hoped that the Zohar would be accepted. So that's one way to look at it. You could take a more cynical view that he wanted to make money off of this book, that he sold it as ancient wisdom. The great historian Heinrich Gretz in the 19th century basically calls the Zohar a forgery. But I think that's too simplistic. Think of any creative artist. Any great creative artist would tell you, I'm not really the ultimate source of what I'm creating. Something is coming through the writer or the dancer or the musician, the sculptor, right? The Greeks refer to this as the muses who inspire the poet. And it could be that Moshe de Leon really felt that he was conveying something beyond his normal consciousness, maybe that he was actually in touch with ancient rabbis. There's also a possibility, I think a good possibility, that automatic writing contributed to the Zohar. There are examples of this in medieval times. It sounds strange, but someone would meditate on a divine name and go into a kind of trance and produce writing without being consciously aware of it. It sounds unbelievable to people who don't aren't familiar with that, but it is a phenomenon. The great poet Yeats, William Butler Yeats, he actually was involved in a long project of automatic writing. Carl Jung used that type of technique to plumb the depths of the subconscious. So it's a complicated thing. A friend of mine in Israel, a very fine teacher of Zohar, says the more we know about the authorship of the Zohar, the more mysterious it is.
Right.
And I think that's really true.
So that's very interesting. You portraying Moshe de Leon, the man who most academic scholars believe wrote at least a very significant portion of the Zohar. You portrayed him as sort of a lone genius working by himself, or at least that could have been interpreted from what you just said. So my question is, do you believe that he was sort of sitting in a room, perhaps in a trance-like state, working on it? Is the Zohar a composition of one brilliant mind, or do you see this more as the composition of a circle, a group of mystics of whom Moshe de Leon was the mouthpiece?
Yeah, it's hard to know. We may never know exactly, but I think it's very likely that he had colleagues working on the Zohar with him. The one figure who immediately comes to mind is his colleague Yosef Jikatila. Right, he was a Kabbalist in 13th century Spain. Moshe de Leon and Jikatila definitely shared ideas. They influenced each other. It could be that Jikatila wrote little sections of the Zohar. Uh, a lot of the narrative of the Zohars are about Shimon discussing Torah with his circle of disciples, and that could reflect the reality of Kabbalists meeting together in 13th century Spain. Maybe Moshe de Leon pretends to be Rabbi Shimon, and other Kabbalists pretend to be Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chia. Maybe Yosef Chikatila is Yossi. It's hard to know, but certainly there are parts of the Zohar that Moshe de Leon did not write. I used to think, and Sholem have actually thought for decades, that Moshe de Leon was the sole author. It's not pretty clear that there are parts he didn't write, so there definitely were other people involved, but it's very difficult to reconstruct that. One thing I want to add, this is fascinating. If you look at the Hebrew writings that Moshe de Leon composed, there he comes out and says, I am the author. I, Moshe de Leon, am writing this book in Guadalajara, Spain, that is, not Mexico, in the year 1286, in the year 1293. Okay, he gives the Hebrew date, and he dates his books. He identifies himself as the author, the total opposite of what happens with the Zohar. And yet, in those Hebrew books, he's very frequently alluding to the Zohar, sometimes even quoting the Zohar or paraphrasing it, sometimes promoting it. Now, how does he refer to the Zohar in those books? He says, Ra'iti bamidrash, I've seen in the Midrash, or Kach amru hakadmonim, this is what the ancient ones have said, or Ra'iti b'Yerushalmi, right? It's always safe to say, oh, it's somewhere in the Talmud, right? But if you say it's somewhere in the Jerusalem Talmud, then you're really safe. Who knows that? Who studies it? So Moshe Leon refers to the Zohar. Sholem says at one point he's using the material as if it's his own. He feels free to paraphrase it, to change it. He's promoting it. In a sense, he's promoting the Zohar in his Hebrew books. And that to me is one of the clearest pieces of evidence that he actually is the author.
Interesting. If I can ask, I mean, quite briefly, just because this is a very large topic, which is that if if someone were to come and say, no, I've been taught that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, or this is a truly ancient text, what would be the principal piece of evidence or the principal argument you would say that no, this is actually a medieval text? Meaning, what are the very clear signs of the medieval authorship, let's say, of the Zohar? Is it language? Is it concepts?
Yeah.
What exactly would you say?
Yeah, there are a lot of different pieces of evidence, and any one of them might not be convincing, but when you put them together, it's pretty overwhelming. First, the Aramaic. The Aramaic is very weird. In fact, very fine scholars of Aramaic stumble over it. When I was a graduate student, I once asked a very fine scholar of Aramaic, I won't mention his name to protect his identity, but a very leading scholar of Aramaic, of early Aramaic, biblical Aramaic, and I said, "Could I do a readings course with you in the Zohar?" Now, I knew that he wasn't that familiar with the Zohar, but I wanted to see his take on the Aramaic, and I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, "I don't deal in corrupt Aramaic."
Ooh, ouch.
And that's it. The Zohar's Aramaic doesn't fit into any category. It's not Talmudic Aramaic. It's not exactly the Targum. It's not biblical, certainly. He draws from all the Aramaic. You really can see Moshe de Leon. He's writing it in Aramaic, but his Aramaic is what he knows from studying the Talmud and from studying the Targum, right? There's this tradition. You should study the weekly Torah portion. You should read it twice in Hebrew and once with Targum Onkelos, right? The leading Targum, the leading Aramaic translation of the Torah. So he grew up, or he spent years studying the Torah portion with Onkelos, and his Aramaic is taken from that. Sometimes you really can tell he's thinking in Hebrew and writing in Aramaic. For example, there are mistakes. There are mistakes in Aramaic. He mixes up the tenses. He mixes up the binyanim, the different conjugations. Sometimes there'll be a Spanish word that actually slips into the Zohar. In terms of the medieval origin, you can see allusions to the Crusades. You can see clear reflections of what it was like to be a Jew in 13th century Christian Spain. There's anti-Christian polemic. Um, and yet then you find him taking things from Rashi, from Nachmanides, from Ramban, from Radak, David Kimchi, Maimonides. You see the influence of medieval authors. Really, I would say, you obviously gain something if you attribute it to Rashbi. Then you revere the Zohar as ancient wisdom, but you lose something too. You lose what the author is struggling with in his contemporary society. There's really something political going on here too, because the Zohar claims to be the deepest secrets of the Torah. And in a sense, this is a way to empower Jews who feel somewhat powerless in Christian Spain.
Right. It is perhaps the one thing they do have control over, which is their inner world of parashanut, of
Yes,
explanation and of the great canonical text, because all other methods of control over their society or over their circumstances have, to a certain degree, been stripped away from them.
right. And that's this claim of being esoteric, of being secret. There are various levels to that. It's secret because the teachings of Kabbalah have not yet spread. It's secret because it's dangerous to delve into mysticism. Right? If you start asking, who am I and what's my relationship to the divine, there's a fine line between mysticism and madness. And the Kabbalists are very careful about that. They want people to be prepared before they venture into that realm. So that's part of the secrecy. The other element is that there's this critique of Christianity. There's really an anti-Christian polemic, right? The Christians are saying that the Jews are the children of the devil. And the Zohar responds by saying Christianity is the demonic. The Zohar can't say that explicitly, but it's pretty clear when the Zohar uses the term sitra achra, the other side, the demonic realm. Sometimes that appears in contexts that are clearly anti-Christian. So the author of the Zohar, the authors of the Zohar are protecting themselves from various kinds of criticism by maintaining the secrecy. Let
Fascinating.
me say one other thing. There's a beautiful expression the Zohar uses to describe its teachings, and that is milin chadatin atikin, new ancient words. The Zohar calls its teachings new ancient words, which is saying a few things. First of all, He's writing it right then, right here and now in 13th century Spain, but he's presenting it as ancient wisdom. So it's new and ancient. Also, these are radical new ideas in Judaism to say that God is male and female, to say that God is ultimately infinity, to say that God needs us. Okay, you find that hinted at it already in rabbinic literature, but for the Zohar, that's a central teaching that God is incomplete without our active participation. So these are radical new ideas, and yet they're presented as ancient wisdom. And in some ways, the Zohar recovers an ancient stratum of religion that's been lost. The clearest example of that is really Shekhinah, which we'll get to maybe a little bit later. But I just would say for now, Shekhinah is the feminine half of divinity. Now, where do you find a feminine divinity in Judaism? It's very hard to find that before the Kabbalah. Basically, you find the Bible attacking that, right? There was a goddess in ancient Israel named Asherah, but she is the enemy of the biblical authors. And yet, somehow in the Kabbalah, the goddess reemerges in a kosher form. It's one way to speak of Shekhinah. So that's an example of an ancient mythic element that's being resurrected by the Zohar.
So this is an interesting question now. Is the Zohar, can we say that the Zohar is is it inventing this? Is it in the third, is Moshe DeLeon sitting down in the 1280s, 1290s, and, you know, and essentially establishing a new tradition through reading these ancient texts? Or can he be said to be representing a sort of subterranean Jewish tradition? In other words, can we say that in between the years of the Bible, throughout rabbinic literature and early medieval literature and the Gaonic literature and all the Midrashic literature, perhaps there is, undercurrents of these kinds of ideas which sort of bursts forth in the Zohar? And if that's the case, maybe that's what Moshe DeLeon means when he ascribes it to Rishon Bar Yochai. Which of these two sides, was he a complete innovator, or was he merely an expresser of ideas that were always there but not on the surface?
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's really a central question. And really, let's start again with new ancient, right? The Zohar is saying what I'm offering you are new ancient words. So they're simultaneously new and ancient. There certainly are elements that you find in the Zohar that you don't find in earlier texts, but often he's recovering that subterranean element you alluded to. You see it in Shekhinah. Let's take another example. You see it in the Seir LaAzazel, right? The scapegoat, right? Which is, you could say, the most important ritual in the entire Jewish year, in a sense, right? It's the central ritual of Yom Kippur. The Bible says, right, in Leviticus, in Sefer Vayikra, have two goats, offer one goat to God, and bring the other goat, La'azazel, to Azazel. Now, who is Azazel? Azazel, turns out, is really a kind of desert demon. So what can that possibly mean, that a goat is being offered to a demon? That sounds, totally forbidden, but that's the pshat of Vayikra. I think you'll find very few traditional rabbis speaking about the pshat meaning of that chapter in Leviticus, but the Zohar insists, yes, you have to give something to the demonic. You have to soothe the demonic. You have to placate the demonic. There are many, many passages in the Zohar. Actually, there's an earlier text, a great midrash, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, right? It's one of the later midrashim. It's probably the 8th century, the Common Era. And there, the Seir Azazel, the scapegoat, is described as shochad, as a bribe. You're offering a bribe to Satan to keep him satisfied so that he won't interfere, so that he won't ruin this vital moment of teshuvah. And so God will absolve and accept Israel's plea and give them atonement. So it's an example of an ancient, in this case, what is the Zohar doing? It's not inventing a sod, it's going back to the pshat. Sometimes the most radical things in the Zohar are recovering the simple meaning, the pshat, but very often you find, new elements. So really, it's both of those elements. It's new and ancient, and that takes us to the word Kabbalah, right? What does Kabbalah mean? It really means tradition, that which has been received. So part of the Zohar is retrieving and promoting ancient tradition, and part of these are these radical new ideas, and it's sometimes hard to separate the two.
Right, that's fascinating, and especially because actually that particular pshat of Si'ur Azazel is mentioned by Nachmanides, by the Ramban al Torah, as
Yes.
the pshat, and he gets criticized something fierce by many later commentators for mentioning it. But you're right, it is a midrashic tradition, and the Zohar does bring it up, and it does seem, at least philologically, that those who Bible scholars today do give at least a portion of credence to this particular reading of it, that Azazel is some kind of demonic entity that has to be placated somehow and for some reason on Yom Kippur.
Right. And it's interesting you mentioned the Ramban, Nachmanides, right? And people
Mhm.
often confuse Ramban and Rambam. There's a
Right.
great Israeli TV skit about confusing the two
Yes.
of them. But
Hayudim
Ramban
Ba'im. It's excellent. Yes.
But Ramban Nachmanides is very important for Kabbalah. You could call him a Kabbalist. He is a Kabbalist in a sense, but more importantly, he's a leading Talmudic figure in 13th century Spain, a very important communal leader in Gerona. And the fact that in his commentary on the Torah, written just 10, 20 years before the Zohar is composed, Ramban, in his commentary on the Torah, frequently brings Kabbalistic secrets. He's also very cryptic, and you could say the Zohar learns his cryptic style partly from the Ramban, also from the Rambam, who we'll get to. But Nachmanides promotes Kabbalah, always keeping it secret, and he's very important for, you could say, making Kabbalah more acceptable and accessible to a certain extent.
Fascinating. I want to. You've mentioned a few of the central ideas, central doctrines of the Zohar, and I'd like to dive a little bit into that because there are some ideas or some constructs, some themes which have been taken on and drastically expanded, and entire worlds built on these themes. One of them, perhaps the major one, is this motif of the 10 Sefirot, this sort of 10 stages of divinity or whatever it is. And the problem is that, so far as I can tell, in the history of Kabbalah, these 10 Sefirot have been given infinite meanings and infinite different ways of describing them and what they are and how they are, and what exactly they're supposed to mean. So could you give us, your notion of what exactly the Sefirot, as you see it in the Zohar, because they are described differently in lots of different books. But what are the Zoharic Sefirot? What are they intending to do? What do they try? What function do they serve, essentially?
hmm Yeah, certainly it's, you could say, the main symbol system of the Kabbalah. And really, we can't talk about the Sfirot without mentioning Ein Sof. So let me talk about both of them together. For the Kabbalists, the ultimate reality of God is inexpressible, is inconceivable, really beyond all names. The Zohar, the Kabbalah invents a designation for that ultimate reality, which is Ein Sof. Literally, there is no end or infinity, right? Modern Israeli scientists and mathematicians, they use the same term to talk about infinity in a very secular way. But that word Ein Sof, infinity, that is the ultimate reality of God. In some ways, that's very close to Maimonides, right? Maimonides would be totally comfortable with describing God as Ein Sof. And really, the Kabbalah learns a lot from Maimonides. We can get to that very shortly. So the ultimate reality of God cannot be expressed, cannot be communicated. That seems too abstract. That's, how can you reach out to that kind of God? So the Kabbalah balances that with these 10 Sefirot. You could say the Sefirot are attributes of God, right? That's Maimonides' language. There's the ultimate reality of God, and then there are divine attributes. So the Sefirot are qualities or aspects of the divine reality. They are the way in which God becomes accessible. You can't touch infinity, but you can relate in some ways to these qualities of God. For example, divine love, chesed, divine rigor, judgment. And that polarity of love and judgment, of din and rachamim, that you have already, of course, in rabbinic literature. So the Kabbalah inherits some of these qualities of God from the Talmud and the Midrash. It picks the number 10 because it had inherited the image of 10 Sefirot. It's natural for human beings to classify things in terms of 10 because of our 10 fingers. And you have in an early Kabbalistic text the reference to 10 Sefirot in Sefer Yetzirah. But there, the phrase doesn't really mean attributes of God. It really means the numbers 1 to 10. Then the original meaning of Sephirah is like the word mispar. Sholem translate this numerical entities. You could say that's its original meaning. But by the time we get to the Zohar, the 13th century, We have already about 100 years of Kabbalah, Kabbalistic books that describe these 10 Sefirot as the aspects of God, the qualities of God. The very first one is Keter, the crown, and that reminds us that the Sefirot are really pictured as a kind of divine body. Okay, really an androgynous body, both male and female. So Keter is the crown on the head. The next two Sefirot are the head, Chokhmah and Bina, wisdom and understanding. So that first triad is really the head of this divine body. And remember, beyond all this is Ein Sof. That's partly how the Kabbalists protected themselves from a charge that they were turning God into a corporeal being. The Sefirot are not the ultimate reality of God. They're the way that ultimate reality is conveyed to us. You could say they're, in a sense, they're a human projection onto that unnameable divine reality. So Keter, Chokhmah, Bina are the divine head. Then you have a right arm and a left arm. Chesed, divine love on the right. Din, judgment, or Gevurah, power on the left. And those are polar opposites, right? God's love and God's rigor. Those are ideally balanced by the central Sefirah, Tiferet, literally beauty, but I think better understood as harmony, the harmony between right and left. Right? If God just loved the world without any accountability, people would get away with murder. If God just judged the world, then we all would be doomed. So God balances din and rachamim, or chesed and gevurah. Then you have two, I would say, relatively minor sefirot, netzach and hod. You could call them the right and left legs. They're really minor versions of that higher polarity, chesed and gevurah. Then you have an interesting erotic, phallic sefirah, yesod. Yesod is the literally foundation. In the divine body, that would be the divine phallus. And there you find the most explicit erotic descriptions in the Zohar when it speaks of Yesod. And of course, the purpose of all of this is to unite the male and the female. Yesod is the most prominently male. Tiferet and Yesod together are the divine husband, intended to unite with, you might say, the main character of the Zohar, Shekhinah. Her technical name, Malchut, kingdom, is the last of the 10 Sefirot. She's the most overtly feminine of all of them. And the purpose of all this is to unite the male and the female within God, to unite the Holy One, blessed be He. You could underline He. That would be Tiferet with Shekhinah. The union of Tiferet and Shekhinah is the goal of Judaism, according to the Zohar, the goal of life. Now, it sounds very strange to introduce this erotic element into theology. That's one of the most prominent aspects of the Kabbalah, one of the most controversial. It aroused a lot of opposition. What does it mean to say that God is sexual? I think, first of all, we have to emphasize that the Sefirot, again, are not the ultimate reality of God. They're the way that we perceive God. So to a certain extent, they're human projection. Now, the Zohar doesn't come out and say that, but the Zohar does say, ultimately, the only thing that exists in terms of God is Ein Sof. The Sefirot exist, and here the Zohar uses a very interesting phrase, misitra dilan, mehatzad shelanu, from our angle. From our perspective, the Sefirot have independent existence, but really, they are all Ein Sof. The way I understand that, and as I say, Moshe Delan would not put it this way, the way I understand that is that the Sefirot are the product of human projection onto this blank slate of the ultimate reality of Ein Sof. I'd like to quote here Voltaire. Voltaire says, if God created us in his image.
Now we're getting to the heavyweights. Now we're cracking out the real Gedolim. Yeah, go on.
Voltaire says, if God created us in his image, we have returned the compliment. So in a sense, we're describing God in human terms. That's what the Sefirot turn into being. Now, in another sense, this simply reflects, going back to Genesis, again, going back to the Pshat, it's a very radical idea to describe God as a human body, but what does Genesis say? B'Tselem Elohim, we're created in the image of God. Now, Maimonides solves that by saying, oh, well, that means the intellect. Our intellect is the image of God, but that certainly is not the Pshat of Bereshit. We're created in the image of God. You could say the Sefirot are the Kabbalist's attempt to spell out what is that prototype? What's the archetype on which we are modeled? The human being is modeled on the Sefirot, and that's why the Sefirot are depicted in such anthropomorphic form.
So it's interesting what you say about human projection, because and this is something I wanted to ask regarding the Sefirot is precisely how literal do you think that the authors of the Zohar and perhaps later interpreters of the Zohar wanted us to take this? In other words, are we supposed to look at the Sefirot like Platonic forms, like, you know, independent constructs that exist out there somewhere, in perhaps another another dimension or another universe, upon which everything else is modeled, but those things have an existence without human cognition? In other words, God created the Sefirot, or God emanated the Sefirot, and from the Sefirot come, let's say, everything else, and then we can sort of, through tradition or through the intellect, or however, somehow understand the Sefirot, somehow commune with them, somehow use them to our advantage or whatever. That's the sort of, let's say, Platonic, so to speak, way of understanding the Sefirot. But or there is the more, I don't know how else to call it, maybe Aristotelian, maybe something else, the way of Sefirot that you sort of seem to allude to, which is that the Sefirot are nothing other than a convenient human construct or blueprint through which we, as you say, project onto a blank slate and understand the fundamentally non-understandable, but not that the Sefirot exist truly and completely independently of themselves. Rather, they exist because that's how we have managed to conceptualize the divine attributes in our poor and limited way. So where do you I mean, obviously I've given two options here. How do you think that the authors of the Zohar were trying to give over the Sefirot?
Yeah, those two polar opposites. Again, I think the Zohar is somewhere in the middle, but both of them are worth exploring. If you open up a typical page of the Zohar, you won't find information about Ein Sof, right? Because Ein Sof is indescribable. There are only a few passages in the Zohar that even use the term Ein Sof. So in a typical passage of the Zohar, it looks like they're talking about God as Chesed, God as Gevurah, as if these really are categories of the divine. And the main theme of the Zohar is the union of the male and female, the human couple, but the human couple stimulates the union of the divine couple. So it seems that the Sefirot are real. And yet, when Rabbi Shimon gives the ultimate revelation of the secrets, right, there are two sections of the Zohar, the Idra Rabbah and the Idra Zuta, the greater assembly and the smaller assembly. Rabbi Shimon gives the deepest secrets, and it's in one of those passages, I think, where he uses this phrase, misitra dilan, from our perspective. So there, Rabbi Shimon says the only reality is Ein Sof, and the Sefirot are true from the way we look at things. So I think the way to solve this partly is to remember that you could say the erotic element, right, which is so central to the Sefirot and so central to the Zohar, and really that's part of the reasons that the Zohar was kept secret. Right, it was kept secret not just because of the anti-Christian polemic, and not just because of the various radical ideas, but because of the sexuality. It's the most erotic, one of the most erotic texts in all of Judaism. It's no accident that the Zohar quotes the Song of Songs constantly, because that eros really appeals to it. So I would say the erotic element is really a metaphor. It's really a way to say that, in a sense, God has not yet achieved fullness. Now the question is, is God one? Of course, monotheism, right, is the great teaching of Judaism. Abraham discovered monotheism, and Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. So God is one. God is one, and yet, what do we say at the end of the Aleinu? Bayomahu Yihiyeh Hashem Echad, and that day God will be one. So the Zohar is caught in this tension between God is one and God is yet to be unified. What resolves that tension? We resolve it. It's up to us to unify God. God is not yet one. So the Sefirot are a way to say there's a dynamic quality to God. There's a potential quality to God. One of the most beautiful names for Shekhinah, you don't find this in the Zohar, but you find it in another Kabbalist around the same time, Sod HaEfshar. That's a name for Shekhinah.
That's very poignant.
So you might say, From the Zohar's point of view, God is potentially here. God is potentially realized in our life. If we don't do anything, if we just sit back, God remains incomplete. So you find this amazing phrase in Kabbalah, tzorech gavoah, right? That appears in rabbinic literature, but in the Kabbalah it means the need on high. God is in need of us. So the way the Zohar plays with that is to say, look, the Sefirot are in dynamic motion. If we don't perform mitzvot, if we don't live a spiritual life, the divine couple remains divorced. The divine couple is not united. We have to make God one. We have to bring God into the world through the way we act. That, I think, is why there's so much emphasis on the Sefirot, because of the human element. The human being unifies the Sefirot.
So fascinating. So, I mean, you've alluded to there, the unification of God, and the truth is that I know that if I'm not mistaken, the Islamic religion, to unify God is an action. It's an act that one has to do, and this you see this in Maimonides as well. Liyached et shemo, to sort of to unify His name. So this brings me to a bit of a broader question, which I want to ask, which is regarding the Zohar and its relationship to the philosophy and theology of its time. Because of course, the medieval period, the time in which it was living, or certainly the couple of centuries preceding the Zohar, was in a way a golden age of theology. I mean, in the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, in the Islamic tradition, some of the great works of theology. And the question is, to what extent was the authors of the Zohar looking over their shoulders theologically? In other words, is the Zohar trying to address specific theological questions and doing so in their own, let's say, specific midrashic, homiletical way, or not? In other words, is it trying to be part of the theological conversation, in your opinion, or is it trying? Is it doing something else completely?
Yeah, the Zohar may claim that it is just in touch with ultimate truth, but certainly it's being influenced by contemporary theological trends. You could say that there's interaction with Christianity. Remember, the Zohar is composed in northern Spain, in Christian Spain. So at this point, Spain, the Spanish rulers have reconquered most of Islamic Spain, but there you do find parallels between Kabbalah and Sufism, for example. Not so much with the author of the Zohar, more with other Kabbalists. There is some Christian influence. Meister Eckhart, who's a little bit after the Zohar. There's some fascinating parallels between Eckhart's theology and the Zohar, but I think the most important figure here is really Maimonides. Right now, Maimonides is important to the Kabbalah in various ways, but I think the most important is how Maimonides championed negative theology, right? That strange term, which really means, right? Maimonides says what? You can't say who God is. It's better to say what God is not. If you say God is strong, that makes him sound like a He-Man. If you say God is smart, that makes him sound like a scholar or a professor. No, say God is not weak. God is not limited. If you try to say what God is, you'll go wrong. So Maimonides even says the more you negate of God, the closer you're coming to understand God. And you really could say that the Kabbalists just take that to the extreme. They actually call God nothing. The Hebrew, we mentioned Ein Sof, but I think a more interesting term is ayin, spelled with an aleph, right? Aleph Yud Nun, nothingness. I think it's better pronounced no thingness. That is a name for the highest of the 10 Sefirot. That's Sefirah Keter, the crown on the head. It's given the name ayin, which means what? It really means you can't know anything about it. God is not a thing. You could say that that's God as pure energy or pure potential. That the Kabbalists really learn from Maimonides. Maimonides doesn't call God nothing, but negative theology they take it to the extreme. Meister Eckhart, just a couple decades after the Zohar, calls God nicht, writing in German, calls God nihil, writing in Latin. John of the Cross, a couple centuries later in Spain, writing in Spanish, calls God nada. So to call God nothing, it almost sounds like atheism, and that's not what the Zohar means. But the Zohar is saying you have to sweep away all your conceptions of God. To the Zohar, that's a really mental idolatry, right? To think of God as this or that is a mistake, a category mistake. So that idea of mystical nothingness, you find that in other mystical traditions, Christian and especially in Buddhism. And I think that's one of the most interesting things in all of Kabbalah, to call God nothingness, and how that derives in a way from Maimonides himself.
And that's fascinating, of course, because there is this irony, I would say, to the Dafka, the Kabbalists' way uh, of describing God in this way of nothingness, because of course what they proceed to do immediately, which Maimonides does not do, is to fill that void with a great deal
Yes.
of material, and that's the difference.
Yes.
They feel,
Yes.
they create the void of God by calling him Ayin, with an aleph, and then they immediately fill it with 10 Sefirot, and to each of the Sefirot they ascribe enormous amounts of symbolism, from months of the year to astrological signs, to figures from the Bible, to everything and anything. They create the vacuum and immediately fill it with just about everything you could possibly want. It's very different from Maimonides in that sense, and quite jarring, I'd say.
Yes, yes, right. They're really attacking Maimonides and yet influenced by Maimonides at the same time. You could say, in a way, they inherit from Maimonides the notion of Ein Sof, even though Maimonides doesn't use that term. But that is such an abstract divinity that they feel, people will be lost. There's no way to reach out. How can you pray to infinity? So they're influenced by him, but then they fill the void. It's beautiful how they play with the word ayin. You have this phrase yesh me ayin, right? So yesh me ayin is creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. And the shot of that is that there's nothing, and then God creates something. But for the Kabbalah, that nothing is this vibrant, teeming vacuum. It's a little bit like the vacuum of modern cosmology, which is anything but empty. It's a seething froth of virtual particles.
Right.
So ayin is really what that is. Out of that maelstrom, out of that whirlpool, comes the emanation of the Sefirot, and the Zohar concentrates on the Sefirot, but in a sense they can protect themselves by saying, oh, no, no, ultimately it's ayin. Don't take this too seriously, that God has an arm, that God has a phallus. Really, really, ultimately, God is unnameable. So they want to have their cake and eat it too, in a sense.
Absolutely. And this is why the famous letter by a different Kabbalist called Avraham Abulafia to Shlomo ibn Ader the Rashba, who says, the Christians divided God into three, and
Yes,
you Kabbalists who believe in the 10 Sefirot, you divided him into 10.
yes, yes.
And there is something to that critique.
Right. I think that's why the Zohar comes back again and again. It's one of the most frequently repeated phrases in the whole Zohar. V'chol echad, right? V'hakol echad. So they'll go on with a long, long description of the divine union and the male and the female and the different limbs of God, and then v'chol echad, and all is one. So that the unity and unification, as you said, the demand that we have to unify God, right? What are later called yichudim, that's based entirely on the Zohar, and that beautiful phrase that's entered the Jewish liturgy in the Sephardic Nusach, L'shem Yichud Kudshabrichu Ushkinte. I'm doing this mitzvah to unify the Kodesh Baruch Hu and Shekhinah. How can you have that kind of sexual union as part of standard Jewish liturgy? That shows you the influence of the Zohar, which never would have happened if people didn't believe that it goes back to Mishnaic times. So I'll just say a word about Elijah. Elijah is such a fascinating figure. Louis Ginsburg, great scholar of Midrash and rabbinics in the 20th century, Ginsburg says, what Moses was to the Bible, Elijah was to the Kabbalah. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, perhaps, but why is Eliyahu important for Kabbalah? Because, okay, we think of Elijah as this zealot, right? In the Bible, he's really a zealous prophet. He slaughters the prophets of Baal, a fascinating figure. But then he becomes something much more, right? Almost all Jews have some relation with Elijah. Why? Because we're waiting for him to appear each year at the Seder. And he shows up at every Brit Milah, at every traditional circumcision. There's a chair for Elijah. Elijah is said to be the one who will announce the coming of the Mashiach. So it's fascinating who he becomes. In a sense, he's a man who never dies. I really thought of the subtitle for the book. It didn't turn out like this, but I thought of the subtitle, The Man Without a Yahrzeit. God, he's the only Jewish hero who doesn't have a yahrzeit.
It would be
because
too niche, but
traditionally,
it's a good one.
what?
It would be a good line. It's just a tiny bit too niche for your publishers, I think, who are trying to actually sell books. Yes.
But what I try to do, my biography is called Becoming Elijah, Prophet of Transformation. And I simply try to describe how he became who he became, how he turned from this zealous prophet to a master of compassion. In a sense, he
Interesting.
becomes a Jewish superhero, right?
Yeah.
He's the one who will show up in times of need. He saves people who are falling from a building or someone who's starving. He miraculously supplies them with food, as he did already in the Bible. But his transformation from that fierce zealot to a compassionate superhero is what I try to do in the book. And really, Eliyahu becomes an embodiment of the Holy Spirit, of Ruach HaKodesh. He is the way that people contact inspiration. And that's why he's important for Kabbalah. It is said about many of the early Kabbalists that they had Gilui Eliyahu, a
Yes.
revelation of Elijah. That you find already in the Talmud. You don't find the term, but you have examples of Elijah appearing to certain rabbis and also to certain commoners. But later in medieval times, he is the one who inspires people. And the question is, are you meeting Elijah or are you going deep within yourself and finding some inner source of inspiration? And there are Kabbalists who talk about those two possibilities and try to relate one to the other. So that's involved in the book too.
I want to move to a little bit of a different area of Zohar studies, which is the Zohar as a work of literature. So you mentioned at the beginning that Gershom Sholem described it as a mystical novel, and there is something quite novelistic about it. I mean, it is, it is part of the medieval period or the late medieval period, which included, great works of literature like Dante's works or Don Quixote and others. And so my question really is, I mean, to what degree, or let's put it this way, how, in a literary way, does the Zohar seek to impart its message? So it has ideas or it has things it wants to get across, and it does so through stories, which is interesting. Can you speak a little about that? What kind of stories does it tell? What kind of literary techniques does it utilize in order to give over its message?
Yeah, the narrative element of the Zohar is really fascinating. You don't have so many long, extended stories. You do have a number of them. One is where the rabbis run into a little child, or it's called the Yanuka.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Yanuka can mean child or infant. Here it's a little boy who, something of a brat, actually. He stupefies the rabbis. He terrorizes them a little bit. He makes fun of them. It turns out that this little child knows more than the rabbis. Maybe it's a little bit of a critique of the Spanish rabbinate at the time, too. So that's a wonderful story. Two rabbis wandering on the road. They run into the child and they learn a lot from him. There's some humor in there. There's some erotic elements too. Another great story is where two rabbis run into a donkey driver. This donkey driver reappears in the Zohar again and again. But in this story, the donkey driver seems to be a total idiot, and he poses some ridiculous nonsense riddles to the rabbis. But of course, it turns out the donkey driver is really a great sage in disguise, and he enlightens the rabbis about the inner meaning of Torah and how you should fall in love with Torah. So you have a number of extended narratives. Then there are narratives with Rabbi Shimon and his circle of disciples. Very often, a couple of the Chavraya, a couple of the Chavirim are out on the road, and they're going to meet Rabbi Shimon, but on the way they'll run into some adventure, some anonymous wandering Jew who knows a lot, or they go through go through some dangerous terrain, or they'll find a beautiful pasture and sit under the trees and study Torah. But they're always on the way to meet Rabbi Shimon, and when they get to him, he gives them the ultimate teaching. And then you have these two dramatic assemblies where Rabbi Shimon gathers his closest disciples and reveals to them deep secrets about the divine romance or the emanation of the Sefirot out of ayin, out of that pool of no thingness. Then near the end of the Zohar, when the Zohar is giving its commentary on the last few portions of the Torah, when Moses is about to die, there we find Rabbi Shimon on his deathbed. So it's as if Rabbi Shimon's death is part of a commentary on Moses' passing. And there, Rabbi Shimon gives the ultimate secrets, and he actually dies in ecstasy as he's delivering his ultimate teaching, and he says to the Chavraya before he goes, "You're all invited to my Hilula." Now, what does Hilula mean? Hilula comes to mean, basically in Jewish literature and Hasidic literature, it really comes to mean yahrzeit, the anniversary of someone's death, because of that passage in the Zohar. But in the Zohar, it doesn't mean yahrzeit, it means what it means in the Talmud, which is wedding, a wedding celebration. So Rabbi Shimon, as he's about to die, says, "You're all invited to my wedding celebration." What does that mean? Rabbi Shimon is going to unite with Shekhinah. He's going to unite with the divine feminine, passing into the next realm. Right? The rabbis actually say in the Talmud that people will see Shekhinah as they're about to die, which doesn't necessarily mean an erotic union. It means you'll see the divine, and that will be part of your death, or the ultimate outcome of your death, returning to God. But for Rabbi Shimon in the Zohar, he is dying in ecstasy and uniting with Shekhinah. So you have those kind of dramatic stories, but what the Zohar does much more frequently is to reimagine the biblical stories. Right? You have a whole volume of the Zohar in Genesis, a whole volume on Exodus. Then you only have one volume on the last three books of the Torah. Why is that? Because all the good stories happen in Genesis and Exodus. So the Zohar is especially attracted to that. And there you find how the Zohar delves into the story. And it turns out the story that you think is about Abraham and Sarah is really about the divine quality of Abraham, chesed, and the divine quality of Sarah, perhaps Shekhinah. So it turns out the Torah is turned into a biography of God. The Zohar changes the Torah into a story about how God unfolds. And let me give just one example. This is one of the most beautiful, radical ideas in the whole Zohar. Right, we just read in the Torah portion last week, or for those of you who are hearing this a month or two ago, the first Torah portion, Bereshit, where Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, right, because of eating the tree of knowledge, from the tree of knowledge. So you have the verse there in Genesis chapter 3, Vayigaresh et ha'adam. He expelled the human. Okay, very simple. Vayigaresh et ha'adam. It's no doubt what it means. God expelled Adam. The Zohar asks an amazing question here. It says, who divorced whom? Why divorce? Because legaresh can mean not only to expel, but to divorce. So it's clear that God expels Adam, and in the Midrash, it actually describes it as a kind of divorce. It's as if God and Adam were intimately connected, but because of what Adam and Eve did, God divorced Adam. The Zohar says, "Man aved tiruchin laman." Who divorced whom? Did the Kadosh Baruch Hu, did the Holy One, blessed be He, divorce Adam or not? Doesn't even spell out the alternative. This is very typical of the Zohar. What's he doing? He's making us come up with a radical, almost heretical alternative. Wait a minute. If God did God divorce Adam or did Adam divorce God? Look what the verse says. It's clear. Vayigaresh et Adam. He expelled, he divorced Adam. The Zohar says, no, 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 no. You have to read it this way. Vayigaresh et. Period. Now, how can you end a sentence with et? That's impossible. The word et means nothing. The word et is such an interesting word. It's composed of just aleph and taf, but all it is an indicator that you're about to come to the object of the sentence. Right? In Hebrew, you can't say, I drank the water. You have to say, I drank et the water. So et doesn't mean anything in and of itself. It's just a link to the next word. The Zohar says, no, 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 no. Et is a symbol for Shekhinah. Why? Because she is Aleph to Taf. She's the entirety of divine speech, of divine power. So now what does the verse mean? Vayigaresh et. He divorced Shekhinah. Who divorced Shekhinah? Then we read the next word, Ha'adam. Adam divorced Shekhinah. It's a wild interpretation. You wouldn't even find that in the Midrash. It's really Midrash on steroids. But what's the point? What is the Zohar saying? I think what the Zohar is saying there, on the one hand, it means that Adam should have unified Shekhinah with her partner, the Holy One, blessed be. Instead of unifying them, he split them. By eating from the tree of knowledge, he fell into the realm of duality, of this and that, of good and evil. Maybe he made that primordial distinction between self and other. Until that point, Adam was like it was an infant. He just felt that he was one with the universe. But then he became aware of his own self. He fell into the realm of duality that we all are trapped in. And because of that, there was this and that. There was do's and don'ts. There was duality. You could say it means that the way I take it is kind of a psychological reading that, uh, in a sense, we're still in the garden, but we don't realize it because we've lost touch with the divine. We've excluded God from our lives, and in a sense, we then become alienated. But however you take it, it's an amazingly radical rereading.
It's hugely radical, and it's basically saying that we humankind have divorced the Shekhinah, and that's why we're no longer in the garden. And
Yes,
and
yes,
this is, I think, one of the typical and most extraordinary things, seemingly, about the Zohar is the extent to which it puts power back into the hands of human beings. It's an amazingly empowering thing, because if indeed God needs us, which of course, according to the philosophers, is an entirely heretical idea, and if indeed it is true that human beings have the power, have the capacity to affect positively the divine realm, to fix it, to affect the rectification, then that entirely throws out of kilter the regular balance that is traditionally understood between humans of God, as of humans being simply subservient, and actually no, human beings being an immensely powerful partner in this relationship. And again, radical is not even the word for it. I mean, it's beyond radical. It's a true re-understanding
yes,
of divine
yes.
human relationship.
No, very much exact. That's exactly it. Now, a couple things. First of all, this really brings us back to Spain, right? The Jews are powerless in Spain, relatively, even though there are individual Jews who are in the royal court, who are financiers, who have made it, but that's a very fragile state of affairs. The Jews feel powerless, and the Zohar is saying, no, you are vital to the cosmic order. Without human action, without Jews performing mitzvot, God is not complete. The divine shefa, the divine flow, can't come into the world unless we unite these two halves of God. So it's up to us to keep the world going. It's partly that, and um, also, yeah, the Zohar is empowering us to reimagine God and to delve into the Torah. Sometimes, one thing I've learned from studying Zohar for so long, it's not even so much what the Zohar says, it's exactly what you picked up on. It's the boldness of creativity, and it's encouraging us to look into Torah and come up with a meaning that will fuel us.
Well, you mentioned the Zohar teaching that we human beings are vital to the cosmic order. I know quite a few human beings who certainly believe that about themselves.
Yeah, you have that danger of megalomania. There's a fine line between mysticism and madness, and there's a fine line. Are you dissolving the ego into God, or are you claiming to be God? And that's why mysticism is so dangerous. And some of the restrictions about studying Kabbalah, I have a lot more respect for those now than I used to, because you see people getting carried away. The ego doesn't give up that easily. You can have a deep insight and then claim it as proof that you are the greatest.
Fascinating. We don't have so long left. I want to ask one or two quick questions. Firstly, about your translation. It's truly, I mean, it's a massive landmark. Certainly in studies of Jewish mysticism, but in Jewish studies in general. The Pritzker edition of the Zohar. It's not just a translation. It's your footnotes and your pirush, your explanations at the bottom. It's truly something. Interestingly, in order to do that, as you've written in your introduction, you had to actually consult many different Zohar manuscripts, because we don't really have, as it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, we don't really have an authoritative version of the Zohar, do we?
Yeah, it's interesting. There is no manuscript that includes the entire Zohar. And that's interesting. And the fact is there probably never was. There probably never was a manuscript of the whole Zohar. Why? Because Moshe de Leon and his colleagues are writing this a little bit at a time. Okay, a commentary on this parasha, a commentary on that parasha. It's not that they do it, in 1 year, but it's written bit by bit. It's circulated bit by bit, and it took hundreds of years for these smaller components to be assembled into what became Sefer HaZohar. In fact, some Zohar scholars, Daniel Abrams is one of the main proponents of this in Israel, says there's no such thing as Sefer HaZohar until it was printed. It didn't really exist as a book until it was printed in the 16th century in Italy. There were two competing publishers who tried to put it out at the same time. I think that may be a little bit exaggerated, but certainly the Zohar as we have it today is only a recent edition, a recent version. So what I did, I knew that I basically had to deal with the standard Zohar. It's become a canonical text, and it's printed. Almost all of the printings follow the Mantua edition. It was done in 1558. So I started translating just from a good printed edition of the Zohar, published by Mossad Harav Kook, edited by Reuven Margalio. It's a beautiful edition. But I had access to some Zohar manuscripts that are all preserved. There are like 600 Zohar manuscripts extant, some of them only a few pages, some of them hundreds of pages. Most of them are on microfilm in Jerusalem. And I had the opportunity to consult them. And when I came across a difficult passage, which is every line of the Zohar, I
Right.
decided it was worthwhile to look at the manuscripts. Once I started looking, I saw that the readings in the manuscripts sometimes seemed to be better than the readings in the printed edition. Now, why is that? That is because every scribe who copied it put in his own 2 cents.
Right.
A scribe copying it 50 years later, 100 years later, said, well, he must have meant this. Or what happens very often, the Zohar paraphrases the Talmud. It doesn't quote it exactly, it quotes it in a freer way. And the scribe would say, no, 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 that's not what the Talmud says. It says it this way. So I wanted to go back to the original. There is no one original, but there's something older and what seemed to be closer to that hypothetical original. So what we decided very soon into the project was that I would create a critical text of the Zohar based on the manuscripts. Whenever I changed anything from the standard printed editions, I noted that, and that's available on Stanford's website. You can Google Stanford Zohar or Stanford Zohar Aramaic, and you'll see that text. It's fascinating to see which kind of things the scribes take out, what they add. So that's how I established that text.
I mean, the funny thing is that in and of itself is a worthwhile. I mean, it's a huge intellectual project in and of itself. Without the fact that you subsequently translated it all into English and added a massive commentary. I mean, that's just that trying to come to a critical edition of the Zohar. We'll get to that in a moment, but I also wanted to ask you. I mean, just about translating the Zohar into English, because when it comes to an exoteric text, meaning a text that's not mystical, that can be understood at least ostensibly at face value. So translating that is not. I mean, it can sometimes be difficult, but at least you can be reasonably certain that what is written on the page is what the author wanted to be read, and it says
Right.
what it means and it means what it says, and therefore you can render it more or less into the target language. Whereas a mystical text, one would presume, is not like that. So just to what degree, I suppose the question would be, to what degree is the Zohar untranslatable? To what degree did you attempt the impossible?
Yeah, yeah. I think you could say, any great text, certainly any great poetic text, is really ultimately untranslatable. There's a beautiful line in the Talmud, right, where Rabbi Yehuda says, if you translate a verse literally, you're a liar. If you add anything, you're a blasphemer. Right? So that doesn't give you very good odds for translation. What makes it even more difficult is that the Zohar, remember, its Aramaic is very weird. It's a corrupt Aramaic, quote unquote, as some scholars would say. What makes it more interesting and more difficult is that the Zohar likes to invent words. It's a little bit like Jabberwocky, right? The Zohar invents words that are in no Aramaic dictionary in the world. Sometimes it'll just take a Hebrew word and add an aleph. My favorite one is devekuta, right? Devekut means cleaving to God. You won't find in any Aramaic dictionary devekuta, but that's the Zohar's word. But that's pretty easy to figure out. Some other words just seem to be nonsense words. The Zohar seems to like certain letters: tet, samech, kuf, taskupa, paskuta. The Zohar invents a word, tikla. Tikla means a water clock. Now, water clocks, were used. A little water would drop a drop at a time, which would hit a certain lever and cause a bell to clang. It was actually a clock that was used in the Middle Ages. Uh, Monks used it in monasteries, so they would wake up at midnight to do their vigil. And the Zohar brings this word tikla in a story about Kabbalists who want to wake up at midnight for tikkun chatzot, for prayers that would be at midnight. So it's amazing. What's the Zohar doing there? It's using an invented word to describe an invention. And I found that some of the Zohar's neologisms, some of the neologisms are specifically for events in 13th century Spain. When he's really alluding to the realia of his time, he puts an invented word. Why? I think it's almost a hint. It's a hint to the reader something's going on here. I think the Zohar was hoping that 600 years later, 700 years later, people would see, here's that neologism. Here's what it means. The Zohar is almost, written with a wink of the eye.
That's wonderfully mischievous. I love that. And do such words typically have a parallel in other languages, other sort of medieval Romance languages, or not really? They're just made of whole cloth.
Sometimes there'll be a Spanish word that drops into the Zohar. The Zohar uses the word gardinin. Gardinin means guardian. Comes from Castilian guardian, so a guard or a warden in a jail or a heavenly power. My favorite one is not in the main body of the Zohar. It's in a later imitation called Tikkun Zohar. And there you have something that Moshe Delaine wouldn't have done something this overt, but this is a beautiful phenomenon. There in this Tikkun Zohar, it says, when you go into the synagogue to pray, your prayer should be filled with fire and spark. Fire and spark with such intense devotion. He says, Esh Noga. Esh Noga. And of course, Esnoga is Spanish for synagoga, for synagogue. So he's bringing the Spanish word. It's almost like, a rabbi today might make a pun using some English slang and, humorously related to something in the Parsha. And there, the Moshe Delaine wouldn't do something that overt, but it's not so far removed from what he does. There's something playful about the Zohar. There's a respect for humor, and that humor can sometimes convey the most profound teachings. And in a sense, all of the Zohar is Moshe Delaine is something of a trickster, right? He's pretending to be Rabbi Shimon. He's pretending that the Zohar is ancient. Sometimes he seems to drop hints about that. But going back to translation, what I tried to do was not to make it too simple, right? Because the Zohar is so intentionally cryptic, I didn't want the English to be that simple. It wasn't the right register, as they say, for the language. And actually, when the book first came out, the first volume I think was published in 2004. The last volume was 2016. It took me 18 years, and Stanford published them volume by volume. And I should say, I've translated the first 9 volumes. The last 3 were done by 2 colleagues of mine, Joel Hecker and Nathan Wolski. They did volumes 10 through 12. Those cover other sections of the Zohar, but the main body of the Zohar and the Torah is what I worked on. And when the first volume was published, my favorite review was one in a local paper in San Francisco. It said, he said, "This is a wonderful book, but I'll tell you, the Zohar is still in Aramaic."
Right. And in a way, that's a big compliment.
I took it as a compliment. My wife was very upset about it. I took it as a compliment because I wanted to preserve the weirdness of the Zohar in some way. Then in the commentary, I explained the symbolism and analyze the Aramaic a little bit and mostly refer to parallels in Midrash and Talmud. I explain what needs to be explained, but because I could do that at length in the commentary, the top half of the page is as cryptic as the Zohar was intended. And because I'm relying on the manuscripts rather than the standard edition, my English, the Aramaic text that I'm working from is more cryptic than the standard text because I took out later scribal accretions. Basically, what I did is to remove scribal accretions. Whatever scribes put in over the centuries, I took out to the extent that I could figure that out.
Well, I'm very excited for when it comes out. You mentioned before we pressed record, you mentioned that they're bringing out a version in Hebrew with your critical Aramaic Zohar edition at the top, and your Pirush, your commentary in Hebrew at the bottom.
Right. That'll be interesting. It is being used in Israel, even in the English, but Israelis are hesitant to look at anything in English and relating to Jewish studies. So it'll be great for the Hebrew edition to come out.
And if I'm not mistaken, you continue teaching the Zohar online.
I have a Zohar
courses.
course. I have an online Zohar course. If you want to find out about it, you can go to my website. Just Google Daniel Matt, and you'll come on the website. And there's a tab, Zohar courses. Basically, we read about 5 pages of the English each time. We've been meeting now for almost 5 years, but people can join at any point. We're just moving straight through We're now beginning volume 3 of the Zohar Pritzker edition, which is just the middle of Sefer Bereshit, of Genesis. I actually have one course where we focus on the English and another course where we focus on the original Aramaic. And that is mostly rabbis and people who have fluency in Hebrew. You don't have to know Aramaic for it. If you have Hebrew fluency, you can try that, and you can see more about it and some sample videos on my website.
Fantastic. Wow, this has been an absolute pleasure. Dr. Daniel Matt, thank you so very much for coming on the podcast of Jewish Ideas. This has been wonderful.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Alicia Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Alicia Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit torahinmotion.org/donate.